Hello and welcome to lecture number 59. This is topic 4.6, major civil rights organizations. And this is going to be an unusually longer lecture because of the amount of material that we have to cover in the civil rights movement. There's going to be several learning objectives, and the first one is to describe the essential methods of the major civil rights organizations. We're going to cover what we call the Big Four organizations that were active in the middle of the 20th century, and some of these we've seen in the past while others may be new. And we'll start with the oldest one, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP grew out of the Niagara Movement in 1909 and had prominent co-founders including W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. They remained active through World War II, and their involvement in war-related activities and Supreme Court decisions, facilitated through their Legal Defense and Education Fund, played a significant role in expanding their membership. At the start of the 1940s, the NAACP had only 50,000 members, and by the end of the war, their membership had grown to 450,000. Similarly, the NAACP's publication, The Crisis, saw a substantial increase in circulation under the leadership of Roy Wilkins, growing from 7,000 issues per month to 45,000. During World War II, the NAACP supported the Double V campaign, which aimed for victory against fascism abroad and racial discrimination at home. This campaign aligned civil rights with the broader ideas of democracy and justice championed during the war, which was a primary reason for their growth in membership. The NAACP's strategic legal efforts helped win major victories in cases like Smith versus Albright in 1944, which struck down the use of all-white primaries. These legal victories provided a foundation for the Brown versus Board education decision in 1954, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. However, the surge in membership following World War II brought differing opinions regarding the organization's future strategy. The debate revolved around whether they should continue challenging discrimination and segregation through court cases or embrace a more direct action approach. This internal conflict reflected a broader division in the civil rights movement. The organization continued to focus on litigation as its main strategy, getting major wins in cases like Alexander versus Holmes and Swan versus Mecklenburg. But they continued to investigate, publicize, and advocate for victims of racial violence. As an NAACP secretary, Rosa Parks investigated the abduction and rape of Reese Taylor by a group of white men, and Field Secretary Medgar Evers in Mississippi carried out public investigation into the 1955 lynching of teenager Emmett Till. The NAACP also coordinated with the other organizations, which we're about to introduce, in marches and voter registration efforts. The second of the Big Four civil rights organizations is CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. It was founded in 1942 by an interracial group of Christian activists. While the group was designed to function as a decentralized organization, one in which cities across the country would organize themselves under the same umbrella, two major leaders who were instrumental in its success were Bayard Rustin and James Farmer. In the middle of the 20th century, CORE focused on direct nonviolent action to challenge discrimination, drawing inspiration from nonviolent resistance techniques used by Mohandas Gandhi during India's struggle for independence from Great Britain, which culminated in 1947. CORE engaged in sit-ins at lunch counters and organized the Freedom Rides, cross-country trips on Greyhound buses from the north into the south. These rides were aimed at pressuring the federal governments to enforce a Supreme Court decision in Morgan versus Virginia from 1946, which banned segregation in interstate travel. Freedom Riders faced severe violence, including bombings and beatings, but their efforts brought national attention to the civil rights movement. In addition to their work in the South, CORE later challenged segregation in Chicago public schools. They organized sit-ins and protests against the school board, eventually compelling the schools to implement integration plans. These efforts came several years after the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. During the early 1960s, CORE coordinated with SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, another key civil rights group that we'll talk about, as well as with the Council of Federated Organizations on the Mississippi Freedom Summer Campaign in 1964. This campaign aims to register voters in a state that was notorious for its disenfranchisement of African Americans. Mississippi had one of the lowest rates of black voter registration in the nation, with less than 5% of eligible black voters registered before 1964. The campaign was met with intense resistance, including violence and the murder of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schormer, which drew widespread public outcry. The next organization is the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was founded shortly after the 1955 to 1956 Montgomery Bus Boycott, during which Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a national voice for the civil rights movement. The SCLC was co-founded as a federation of civil rights groups to coordinate and support local movements with the invaluable assistance of Ella Baker, a prominent grassroots organizer. The Montgomery Bus Boycott itself was sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest in December 1955 and lasted 381 days, marking a major early victory for the movement. In the middle of the 20th century, the SCLC focused heavily on securing voting rights for African Americans. One notable effort was their involvement in the Albany Movement, an initiative aimed at registering black voters in Albany, Georgia. However, the movement was one of the few instances where the SCLC's protest did not achieve the desired results. The peaceful arrests of activists failed to generate the national attention that was often key to leveraging political change. The Albany movement highlighted the challenges of maintaining momentum when local law enforcement avoided violent responses and minimized media coverage. The SC also collaborated with CORE, SNCC, and the NAACP during the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Together, they created freedom schools which educated black citizens to help them pass literacy tests, a primary tool used to disenfranchise African Americans. The SCLC further demonstrated its commitment to combating systemic racism during the Birmingham campaign of 1963. They sent waves of protesters to Birmingham, Alabama, where activists faced brutal repression from local authorities led by Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor. It was during his imprisonment in Birmingham that Martin Luther King Jr. penned his iconic Letter from a Birmingham Jail. In this powerful treatise, King criticized those who urged patience, famously declaring, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The Birmingham campaign's image of children being attacked by police dogs and high-pressure hoses created national and international outrage. Although the SCLC often collaborated with the NAACP, tensions arose over differing strategies. The NAACP focused on legal challenges and litigation, while the SCLC prioritized direct action and mass protests. Despite these differences, the SCLC frequently relied on the NAACP's legal expertise to get their protesters out of jail. The last of the big four civil rights organizations is SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was founded in 1960 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's Ella Baker when she invited 150 student activists from across the country to her alma mater, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Baker envisioned a new type of civil rights group, one that was more decentralized and grassroots-driven than existing organizations. Her emphasis on participatory democracy inspired young activists to take leadership roles in their communities, shaping the ethos of SNCC. Some of SNCC's chairpersons went on to become central figures in the civil rights movement and later the Black Power movement. Its first chairman, Marion Barry, who would later become a prominent political figure as the mayor of Washington, D.C., John Lewis was SNCC's fourth chairman, but he had already made a name for himself as a student organizer, leading sit-ins in Nashville while attending Fisk University. He later went on to become a U.S. representative. In the middle of the 20th century, SNCC collaborated with CORE on the freedom rides, which began in Washington, D.C., and aimed to desegregate interstate bus travel all the way to New Orleans. Despite enduring extreme violence, buses were firebombed and activists were brutally beaten in segregated waiting rooms, SNCC members adhered strictly to their philosophy of nonviolence. The freedom rides helped pressure the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce desegregation in interstate travel in 1961, as mandated by the early Supreme Court rulings. SNCC also played a critical role in the Selma to Montgomery marches in Alabama, working alongside the SCLC. On March 7, 1965, during the first of these marches, later known as Bloody Sunday, peaceful protesters were attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. John Lewis, by then a prominent SNCC leader, was severely beaten. The national outrage that followed helped pave the way for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Stokely Carmichael, another of SNCC's chairmen, took over leadership from John Lewis in 1966. His tenure marked a shift in SNCC's philosophy as he popularized the slogan and philosophy of Black Power. This approach emphasized racial pride, economic self-sufficiency, and political autonomy, diverging from the early focus of nonviolence. The term Black Power was first widely used by Carmichael during the James Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi in 1966. After his time with SNCC, Carmichael went on to work with other organizations, including the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, further advancing his advocacy for Black liberation. All four of these major civil rights organizations shared key methods in the fight for equality. They were nonviolent, direct, and racially inclusive, with both black and white activists participating in their protests. The nonviolent forms of civil disobedience they employed included marches, sit-ins, litigation, economic boycotts, and the strategic use of mass media to garner public support. One example of their nonviolent tactics was the Selma to Montgomery March, which was organized to advocate for greater access to voting in Alabama. Another example is the Greensboro sit-ins, initiated by the Greensboro Four. 4 students from North Carolina A&T State University, who in 1960 sat at a segregated lunch counter at a Woolworth store to challenge discriminatory practices. Their actions inspired a wave of sit-ins across the South, involving over 70,000 participants by the end of that year. Organizations like CORE and SNCC later coordinated nationwide sit-ins at department stores with lunch counters in an effort to pressure businesses to desegregate their services. Litigation was another critical strategy. One notable case was Browder v. Gale of 1956, which successfully challenged the segregation of public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama, following the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This case led to the Supreme Court's ruling that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, making a major victory for the movement. Economic boycotts were also used effectively. For instance, after sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, national chains that refused to desegregate their southern locations were boycotted in the North and the West. These boycotts applied financial pressure, making it costly for businesses to maintain discriminatory practices. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, which lasted over a year, is perhaps the most famous example, as it led to significant economic losses for the bus system and local businesses. The mass media also played an important role in the success of the civil rights movement. Activists strategically used television to broadcast images of violence against peaceful protesters, such as the brutal attacks on demonstrators during the Birmingham campaign or on Bloody Sunday in Selma. These broadcasts shocked the conscience of the nation and helped shift public sentiment in favor of civil rights. The rise of television in the 1950s and 1960s made it an especially powerful tool as millions of Americans witnessed these injustices from their living rooms. Although these nonviolent efforts were often met with violence from segregationists and law enforcement, the philosophy of self-defense was not central to these organizations. Their primary focus remained on nonviolent resistance. However, as we will discuss in topic 4.9, self-defense philosophies, as advocated by figures like Malcolm X and groups such as the Black Panther Party, emerged in contrast to these nonviolent struggles. The second learning objective is explain how nonviolent resistance strategies mobilized the civil rights movement. In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, protesters from the Big Four civil rights organizations began to grow frustrated with the lack of progress. Cities in the South, including Birmingham, started to adopt strategies similar to those pioneered in Albany, Georgia. In Albany, the police chief implemented a tactic of jailing protesters without violence, charging them with minor offenses unrelated to discrimination. This approach effectively took the wind out of the sails of the civil rights movement by avoiding the dramatic violence that typically garnered national attention. It also strained the movement's resources as civil rights organizations struggled to spare additional protesters who could risk jail time. In response to this challenge, the movement shifted its strategy, controversially deciding to involve children as protesters. This idea was not universally supported within the movement, as some leaders were concerned about the ethical implications. However, children were seen as less likely to face penalties such as job loss or eviction, which many adult protesters risked. The involvement of children provoked an extreme response from Birmingham's police chief, Bull Connor. Connor unleashed brutal tactics against the young demonstrators, including setting police dogs on them, beating them with nightsticks, and spraying them with high-pressured fire hoses powerful enough to tear the clothes off of their bodies. The Children's Crusade, as it became known, involved over 1,000 children arrested on its first day alone, drawing widespread attention to the movement. These violent images, broadcast on television and published in newspapers, shocked and angered audiences both domestically and internationally. The brutality not only shifted public opinion, but also increased pressure on the federal government to take action. President John F. Kennedy responded by publicly condemning the events in Birmingham and calling for civil rights legislation, which ultimately led to the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Internationally, the images of violence against children damaged the United States' reputation during the Cold War. The Soviet Union used these events as propaganda, highlighting the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to champion freedom and equality while permitting such abuses. The outrage further underscored the urgency of addressing racial injustices in America. The events in Birmingham marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, demonstrating the power of nonviolent resistance combined with strategic media exposure to challenge systemic racism. Later in the summer of 1963, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march was rooted in an idea A. Philip Randolph had first proposed during World War II. In 1941, Randolph had threatened to organize a 100,000-person march on the National Mall if President Franklin D. Roosevelt did not issue an executive order eliminating segregation and discrimination in the defense industry. Roosevelt responded by signing Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in war industries and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This marked one of the first major victories in the civil rights struggle of the 20th century, setting a precedent for using mass demonstrations to pressure the federal government. The 1963 March on Washington was a coalition effort involving black civil rights organizations, including the National Urban League and the Big Four, as well as religious and labor groups such as the United Auto Workers, or UAW, and the AFL-CIO. Ultimately, the march drew an estimated 250,000 people to the Lincoln Memorial, making it one of the largest gatherings in U.S. history at the time. It was also notable for being one of the first large-scale civil rights events to include significant participation from white allies, reflecting the broadening support for the movement. The march highlighted issues of economic inequality, unemployment, and racial discrimination, and it aimed to push the Kennedy administration to advance a civil rights bill. This legislation, already proposed in the aftermath of the violence in Birmingham, sought to address racial segregation and voting rights while also incorporating provisions for a national minimum wage, public works projects, and job training for the unemployed. Out of the 12 speakers at the event, John Lewis of SNCC was the youngest. His speech was seen as the most militant of the day, reflecting the frustrations of younger activists with the slow pace of change. However, his speech was revised just hours before delivery after some participants deemed it too critical of the Kennedy administration and the proposed civil rights bill, which Lewis felt was too weak. This incident underscored the fragile nature of the coalition behind the march, revealing tensions between the more radical elements of the movement and its moderate allies. The event is most famously remembered for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, in which he eloquently called for an end to discrimination and racism. The march not only helped to build support from the public, but also added momentum to the civil rights legislation that would eventually culminate in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the summer of 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Summer highlighted the brutal racial violence African Americans faced while attempting to exercise their right to vote. In Mississippi and other southern states, only 5% of the eligible black voters were registered, as most were intimidated into staying away from the polls or disqualified by discriminatory education and literacy requirements imposed by the state. The Freedom Summer campaign was spearheaded by Robert Bob Moses, who mobilized the Council of Federated Organizations, or CFO, to address this widespread disenfranchisement. The event that kicked off the campaign was a mock election for disenfranchised black voters, which drew the participation of 83,000 people. Inspired by the success, Moses established 41 freedom schools across the state. These schools not only prepared African Americans to pass voter registration tests, but also celebrated black history and fostered activism. To bring national attention to the cause, Moses invited white Northern student activists to join the campaign. However, the increased activism drew violent resistance, culminating in the abduction and murder of 3 young activists, James Chaney, an African American from Mississippi, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, 2 white students from the North. These murders were perpetrated by the KKK with the collusion of local authorities. Their tragic deaths became a national and international scandal, intensifying pressure for federal intervention in the South. The activism in Mississippi also inspired the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, led by Fannie Lou Hamer. The MFDP served as an alternative to the whites-dominated Democratic Party in Mississippi. Civil rights activists supported the National Democratic Party for its push for civil rights legislation, but were deeply skeptical of state-level whites Democratic officials who continued to uphold Jim Crow laws. At the 1964 Democratic National Convention, the MFDP demanded to be seated as the legitimate Democratic delegation from Mississippi, challenging the all-white delegation. The conflict forced the National Democratic Party to broker a compromise, offering the MFDP 2 symbolic at-large seats, but maintaining the white delegation's majority. This decision elevated the standing of civil rights groups by putting their demands on the national stage, but fell short of the MFDP's goals. Fannie Lou Hamer's impassioned testimony about the violence she faced as voting rights activist was broadcast on national television, deeply moving viewers and bringing widespread attention to their cause. However, the compromise revealed cracks within the civil rights coalition. Younger, more radical groups like SNCC saw the deal as a betrayal and grew increasingly frustrated with the moderate tactics of older organizations. These divisions deepened rifts among the Big Four civil rights groups, foreshadowing the future conflicts over strategy and goals. And finally, the last learning objective is explain how civil rights activism in the mid-20th century led to federal legislative achievements. The first major legislative achievement of the civil rights movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a result of the coordinated efforts of the Big Four civil rights organizations and their allies. President John F. Kennedy had committed to introducing a civil rights bill in June 1963. His decision was solidified by events such as the escalating violence in the South and the murder of Medgar Evers, a prominent NAACP field secretary. Evers was assassinated on June 12, 1963, just hours after Kennedy delivered a televised address urging Congress to pass comprehensive civil rights legislation. As the proposed bill made its way through Congress, compromises to appease Southern politicians significantly weakened its provisions. However, the trajectory of the legislation changed dramatically following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, elevated to the presidency, seized upon the bill as a tribute to Kennedy's legacy. Johnson declared it a national priority, framing its passage as a memorial to the slain president. Johnson, a seasoned politician with extensive experience in the House of Representatives and the Senate, became personally involved in the bill's passage. His mastery of legislative maneuvering was evident as he secured necessary votes to overcome a lengthy filibuster in the Senate led by Southern Democrats. At 60 days, his filibuster was one of the longest in U.S. history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law on July 2, 1964. It ended segregation in public accommodations and prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This was the first time gender was explicitly protected in civil rights legislation after being added as an amendment by opponents of the bill who hoped its inclusion would hinder its passage, a strategy that backfired. The act also addressed discrimination in employment and labor unions, establishing strong enforcement provisions such as withholding of federal funds from discriminatory programs. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, to monitor and enforce employment protections. These enforcement mechanisms made the act significantly stronger than earlier versions proposed during Kennedy's administration, which was a testament to Johnson's political skill. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was designed to protect the voting rights of African Americans. Its passage followed the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1964, which prohibited poll taxes, one of the many strategies used to disenfranchise African American voters, particularly in the South. The motivation for the Voting Rights Act was driven by the events surrounding the Selma to Montgomery marches. On March 7, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday, peaceful civil rights activists were brutally attacked by state troopers and local police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The violence was televised nationally, shocking the American public. In response, President Lyndon Johnson delivered a powerful address to Congress just 1 week later, promising comprehensive voting rights legislation. He concluded his speech with the civil rights mantra, "We shall overcome," signaling his solidarity with the movement. The act outlawed discriminatory practices that had been used to suppress African American voting rights. It eliminated literacy tests, educational requirements, and other barriers to voter registration. This was a direct response to practices like those in Alabama, where only 2% of eligible black voters were registered to vote before the act's passage. The act also included provisions to federal oversight of voter registration in states and localities with a history of voter suppression. The Attorney General was empowered to send federal examiners to register voters in areas where racial discrimination had been prevalent. It also prohibited states and municipalities from enacting laws or procedures that could restrict voting rights without federal approval, a process known as pre-clearance. Election monitors were also deployed to ensure that voting on Election Day was free from intimidation or coercion. The Voting Rights Act was highly effective, resulting in a dramatic increase in voter registration and participation among African Americans. For example, in Mississippi, black voter registration increased from just 6% in 1964 to nearly 60% by 1969. However, the act has faced significant challenges in recent years. In the 2013 Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder, the court invalidated the pre-clearance requirement, arguing that the formula used to determine which states were subject to oversight was outdated. This decision significantly weakened the act, allowing states to implement laws such as voter ID requirements, reducing early voting, close polling places, and make other changes that have disproportionately impacted minority voters. Between 2012 and 2018, nearly 1,700 polling places were closed across the United States, with many closures concentrated in areas with significant Black and Latino populations. And finally, here's the recap. The big four civil rights organizations included the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, and CORE. Organizations used a combination of nonviolent, direct, and racially inclusive protests and grassroots efforts. The variety of strategies included major campaigns and events like the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And finally, successes of the civil rights movement included the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.